The last thing you want to hear when you need your auto insurance most is a robot with countless irrelevant menu options. Which is why with USAA Auto Insurance, you'll get great service that is easy and reliable, all at the touch of a button. Get a quote today. Restrictions apply.
USAA. This episode is brought to you by Loom by Atlassian. Are you feeling stuck at work? Get your team unstuck with Loom video messaging and move work forward. Use Loom to simultaneously record both your screen and yourself to share a quick update, provide feedback, train a colleague, and everything in between. Plus, add Loom AI to your meetings for instant written notes and recordings. Try Loom today at Loom.com. That's LOOM.com.
The Tudors Dynasty Podcast.
Hello and welcome back to the show. I'm your host, Rebecca Larson, and I'm so happy to welcome back once again Sharon Bennett Connolly. Welcome back, Sharon.
Thank you, Rebecca. Always nice to be here.
It's always fun chatting with you. And today we're going to talk about, I think, some women that I really don't know anything about at all. And we're going to talk about the daughters of Eleanor of Aquitaine, I should say, and Henry II, right?
Yeah.
She didn't do it all on her own. She needed a little help.
Well, you also have to be specific because she had two daughters with King Louis as well, Louis VII of France. So if you just say the daughters of Eleanor of Aquitaine, we're talking about 5 women. If it's Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, then it's only 3 of them.
Oh, well, are we going to talk about all of them today?
No, we best just do the 3.
Okay, that works better. That works better for me.
I don't know enough about the other 2, I'm afraid.
That's all right.
I know their names and when they were born, but their life, I haven't actually looked into their lives, which is really remiss of me, I suppose. No. And something I should rectify.
Yeah. Well, today we're going to talk about then the children of Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II, because I always feel like all we know about are their sons and what their sons did. And it's time to bring these women into the light. And that's one of the things that I love to do on this show. And I think you like to as well, don't you?
I do, yes. That's it's my raison d'etre, bringing the women back into the light and putting them back into history.
Yeah. Okay. So let's just start from the beginning. Let's do a quick recap of who Eleanor of Aquitaine and Henry II were.
Right. Eleanor, Duchess of Aquitaine in her own right, was born in the 1120s. She was married at about 15 or 16 to Louis VII of France. And she even went on crusade, on the Second Crusade with Louis in the late 1140s. But their marriage was not perfect, far from perfect, in fact. They had 2 daughters, Marie and Alex, but no sons. And I don't know if it's true or not, but Eleanor is famous for saying that she married a monk. They basically did not get on. And in the early 1150s, their marriage disintegrated when they got back from crusade. On the way back from crusade, they visited Rome, and the Pope actually put them in a bed together and blessed the bed to try and get them to reconcile. And their second daughter was born 9 months later. So it worked, sort of. But in the end, the marriage was annulled on the grounds of consanguinity, meaning they were too closely related. It's a general get out of jail free card for any king who manages to persuade the Pope that he wants a divorce, so long as you're within, I think it's 7 degrees of affinity, which means basically 6th cousins, and more or less the entire royalty of Europe would be within those 7 degrees of affinity. You can get an annulment. Not everybody wanted one, second, third cousins did tend to marry quite frequently within the royal houses. But it was just, if the marriage didn't work out, then at least you've got this get out of jail card, which works a lot of the time. But sometimes popes, if you've upset the Pope, it doesn't work, which is why Louis VII's son, Philip II, actually couldn't get out of a marriage because he'd upset the Pope, even though he claimed similar reasons. So I'm digressing. Apologies. So yes, they were divorced, and Eleanor rode back to Aquitaine, a free woman, leaving her two daughters behind to be raised by Louis VII. In those days, the mother had very few rights over her children. Even if she'd wanted or tried to push to take them with her, they were daughters of France rather than daughters of Eleanor of Aquitaine. So they stayed with their father and were raised to be married off where it suited Louis VII rather than Eleanor of Aquitaine. So she rides back to Aquitaine. The year before the divorce, Geoffrey of Anjou had visited the French court with his son, Henry, Duke of Normandy. He was by that time. And Henry had met Eleanor of Aquitaine. And it's possible that they made an arrangement at that point because Eleanor was already looking at getting divorced. So when she got back to Aquitaine, Henry, Duke of Normandy and Count of Anjou arrived about within a little while afterwards, and they married, which infuriated Louis VII because he'd made this agreement with Eleanor that once she was allowed to divorce, but he had a say in who she married, an agreement which she totally ignored and decided she was marrying who she wanted. She was Duchess of Aquitaine and she could marry whoever she wanted, so she did. And Henry at that time was Duke of Normandy, Count of Anjou, and waiting to become King of England. In 1153, Stephen in England had made a deal with Henry that he would succeed him ahead of Stephen's own son. So she was shortly to become Queen of England as well. And that happened in 1154. And Henry and Eleanor must have really, can I say pissed off? Must have really pissed off Louis VII. Their first child, William, was born about a year after they married, and a son. She'd spent all this time married to Louis VII, had no sons. Gets married to Henry, first child comes along, is a son, William. Unfortunately, poor William only lived till he was 3, but by that point, they also had Henry, the young king, and Richard I was born next, and then in 1168, okay, I can't remember when she was born now. 1158, not 68. 68 was too late. 1158, I think it was. The first daughter came along, who was called Matilda, named after her grandmother, Empress Matilda. A very formidable woman and one of my personal heroines she's just a role model. She's incredible. There was first Matilda, then there was Eleanor, and then the youngest was Joan, who was born, Joanna, who was born the year before King John was born. So between 1158 and 1166, 3 daughters were born, as well as the 5 sons.
Yeah. So Eleanor did her job getting the king's sons, but also having daughters meant that they could form strong alliances.
Yes. Daughters, people think of royal daughters as being seen now as a necessary evil rather than something to be celebrated. It isn't true. Daughters, well, they needed a son to succeed to the throne. Daughters were incredibly useful as to forge alliances with other countries. And I don't mean that I'm literally writing their stories at the minute in a book, The Medieval Princess, which will be out this time next year. The idea that they were just married off and sent to foreign countries and just left there, that was the last you see of them, the last you hear of them. That was not the purpose of a princess. The idea of marrying them to a foreign ruler was to create a familial, close, personal link with that ruler. They were the ultimate diplomats. Before we had permanent ambassadors, that is what a princess was. She was a permanent ambassador for her father or her brother when he succeeded to the throne in the country that she married into. So it wasn't a case of you just marry them off and never see them again and never communicate with them again. It created a personal link between nations.
Yeah. And usually there was some type of treaty signed too, wasn't there?
Yes, it was. It was usually part of a treaty of either mutual assistance, if it was just in peacetime, or to end a war, if it if you were at war with the other country. And the idea is that if you cement it with a marriage to create this personal link and hopefully prevent the war from restarting or future wars, because you've got this link where you can communicate personally with the other ruler without having to go through all the diplomatic machinations and that. And you often get little notes from the Queen to back to her brother or father, where she's saying, look, we've got this. Don't listen to what people are saying. We're not going to go to war with you. Just keep communicating with us, and war won't happen. And that was a really important part of the princess's job, and that's what happened a lot between England and Scotland. There were, girls who married from the English throne into the Scottish throne. There's often missives between them and their brothers saying, look, just don't invade Scotland. It wasn't what was meant, So it's a really important job. And these girls were raised to do this job. You often say, oh, girls weren't educated. They were. They had to be. They had to be educated in diplomacy, to at least read, if not to write, because, of course, writing in those days was often the job of the priests. But girls were taught to read. They were taught diplomacy. They were taught foreign languages, rhetoric, how to communicate with people of all kinds, because that's what they would have to do in their daily lives. You could not send an ignorant girl to Germany, Sicily, or Spain, like they sent the daughters of Eleanor of Aquitaine, without teaching them what they needed to survive and thrive in those new societies.
Yeah, I can't. I always try to put myself in their shoes, right? What would it have been like to be raised to be likely a queen or a duchess or a countess and have to leave everything that you know and go to this country that you've more than likely never visited in your entire life and try to fit in?
Mm. It must have been difficult, but they were raised in order to be able to do that, and when they did when they did have their marriages arranged, it was generally, certainly with Matilda, the eldest, and with Joanna, the youngest, who married the King of Sicily. And each of their prospective husbands sent ambassadors to England to meet the king and make the arrangements, but to also meet the princesses. And the ambassadors would have had interviews with the young women to explain to them and teach them about the new land they're going to, so that they were not totally ignorant, so that they didn't commit a faux pas, so that they didn't go there and suddenly say something really unpleasant about the new native people, and cause a diplomatic embarrassment in itself. They were going to be the ambassadors of their country, so they had to be taught, even from a very young age. Joanna, when she married the King of Sicily, was only 11 years old. So they were taught from a very early age their own positions and the positions they were going to fulfill in life.
Yeah. So during the reign of Henry VIII, and I always try to bring up the Tudors because many of the people listening, that's why they come here. But I also like to expand and teach you about other eras. So, for example, with Henry VIII, right, before he would marry his bride, if she was a foreign bride or whatever, he would receive a portrait of her. Did they ever do anything like that back in the 12th century, or was it just that visuals. They send somebody over to get a good
Yeah,
look.
they didn't do portraits until the Renaissance and the actual advent of using perspective in portraits. They were highly inaccurate. So portraits weren't very good, but the ambassadors, we often get reports of from ambassadors saying that the prince, the lady was comely or attractive. She had giving a description of the princess and flatter what attributes, good attributes she had. So that the chap marrying her knew a little bit about her when he
I was gonna
before
say
she arrived.
that's got to be tricky because what's the old saying? The beauty is in the eye of the beholder.
Mm.
So if the guy coming, from let's say France over to England to get his eyes on a princess, he might think she's attractive, but maybe his king won't.
To be honest, it wasn't a prerequisite for a marriage. We have this very romantic attitude to marriage. In those days, it was a business arrangement. They were more bothered about what land and money they were going to get accompanying the bride than they were about the bride's appearance.
Mm.
If they didn't like the bride, then they could just do their duty with her and then go and find another woman to spend time with.
Yeah.
So long as they could actually do the deed, they weren't particularly bothered about sharing her company sometimes. The most successful marriages are when attraction and respect and go hand in hand, when the actual diplomacy and affection are both there. They're the more successful marriages.
Yeah. And I'm sure the fact that their mother, Eleanor, had quite a few sons was also a bonus to any foreign prince.
Yeah, yes. And it couldn't always be said that that would follow through in the daughters, but certainly in two of the three daughters of Eleanor and Henry, it certainly bore fruit. The eldest, Matilda, had a number of sons and daughters. She had about 8 children, I think. And same with the youngest, the middle one, Leonor, although she suffered a number of miscarriages and deaths in early childhood that cannot have been easy to take, but she did end up having a surviving son who succeeded his father.
Mm.
Although he died, I think it was a month later, and was succeeded by his sister. So it was actually the sister who became queen, regnant in the 12th, 13th centuries. But she abdicated in favor of her son.
Of course she did.
Yeah. But in the case of the youngest, Joanna, she may have had a son with the King of Sicily. We're not quite sure. There's mention of one chronicler, of a son from one chronicler, who was named Bohemond, but he's the only chronicler who mentions it. And he doesn't know it personally. He says he's heard it from somewhere else. So we're not totally sure. She did have a surviving son and daughter from her second marriage to the Count of Toulouse, and actually died in childbirth, giving birth to a son who died shortly afterwards as well.
Mm.
So she had fewer children, but each of them did have sons, the necessary sons, and daughters who actually made, especially with Eleanor, who married the King of Castile, they made some very good marriages and diplomatic marriages within Spain and Portugal to help foment peace.
Mm. Let's go back to the eldest daughter, Matilda, and look at her life briefly here. When was she first betrothed? Do we know?
So yeah, Matilda was born in 1156. And she was married to Henry V, Duke of Saxony. He was known as Henry the Lion. And it was a really successful marriage. They did have a number of children. And they were married in 1165. Hold on. So negotiations began in 1165.
Okay.
So Matilda was only 9 years old, 8, 9 years old when they started deciding it. And she left England.
This episode is brought to you by Cadillac. When you have 4 new tires, every drive feels fresh. Right now, buy 3 select tires and get 1 for just $1 during the Cadillac Certified Service Fresh Start Tire event. Visit Cadillac.com/service offers or see dealer for full details. At participating U.S. GM dealers only. Highest or equal value tire will be $1. Offer ends 5/31/2025. Not available with other offers.
Switch to Verizon Business and get more from your internet without paying more for your internet. Get LTE Business Internet starting at $39 a month when paired with select business mobile plans. That's unlimited data, and with it, unlimited possibilities. Start saving today with Verizon Business, ranked #1 in small business internet customer satisfaction by J.D. Power. Starting price for 25 megabits per second LTE internet plan with smartphone plan savings, plus taxes, fees, and economic adjustment charge. Terms apply. For J.D. Power 2024 award information, visit jdpower.com/awards.
Oh yeah, 1166. In the summer of 1166, and she had a trousseau worth £63, which included saddles, gilt fittings, silk cloths, tapestries. They basically, when they left England to join their husbands, they were basically sent with all the household goods they would need. You know, they went with beds and bedding and everything, even though pretty sure their husbands probably already had this. But the idea was to make sure that they had everything they needed. And it was the stuff that was sumptuous, that was suited a queen or a duchess. So the relationship, the marriage with Henry the Lion, he wasn't a king, he was Duke of Saxony, but he was a cousin of the Holy Roman Emperor. So it was seen as a very good marriage and a good relationship for Henry II to have with the Holy Roman Empire, which was on the eastern borders of France. So basically, he's shoring up his allies. When you look at it, when you think about it, he makes a marriage for Matilda in Germany. So that's the eastern border of France, and a marriage for Eleanor with Spain on France's western border, and then marriage in Sicily with Joanna on to the south. You know, he's basically surrounding France here.
An army around France.
Yeah.
Well, do we have any idea if Matilda had any contributions as queen, or was she kind of that silent partner that sat back and just produced heirs?
Oh no, we know that she was. She and Henry appear to have had a very good relationship and a very good partnership. She did produce a lot of children and heirs, and their eldest daughter was born in 1172. So she was only 15 or 16 when she became a mum. The problem for their relationship was that Henry was quite a powerful Duke of Saxony, but he wasn't Holy Roman Emperor. And the Holy Roman Emperor had a falling out with him, and they quarrelled. And he was literally kicked out of Germany. He was exiled from Germany. But the emperor actually said Henry had to leave Germany, but Matilda didn't. She could have stayed and administered and acted as regent for Henry's lands, but she only had a young family, and she left with Henry. And they came to Henry II's court, joined him in Normandy, and then came to England. Whilst Henry II sent his ambassadors back to Germany to negotiate with the Holy Roman Emperor, who was Frederick Barbarossa, and tried to get him to let Henry back into Germany.
Wow. Okay, so you said they had roughly 8 children together, I think, something like that. Of all
Yeah.
of all of the children that they have, is it possible to choose which one was the most successful or had the best alliance, maybe?
Well, I think the most successful you'd have to say was Otto, who became Otto the Fourth Holy Roman Emperor.
Oh,
So, pretty successful, except he didn't keep the empire for long. And he was touted as heir to Richard the Lionheart at one stage. They're quite a good, strong family. I mean, when Matilda and Henry came to England because they'd been kicked out of Germany, Matilda was able to persuade her father, Henry II, to ease the restrictions on Eleanor of Aquitaine because she had rebelled against Henry II with their sons in 1173. And when Henry reconciled with his sons in 1174, he didn't extend the olive branch to Eleanor. He captured her and imprisoned her instead and sent her to Old Sarum, Salisbury, in England to imprisonment. So when Matilda arrives at the English court, finds her dad and goes, "Where's mum?"
I can't even imagine that story. Every time I hear it, just gets me that he would just lock away Eleanor, but he clearly saw her as some form of threat.
Yes, definitely. She was a strong, independent woman, and she had her own duchy. If she wanted, she could have well and truly caused problems for Henry II if she was free. But so she was released under house arrest so that she could spend time with Matilda and be there when Matilda gave birth. She gave birth to a son in Winchester.
Hmm.
And when she went back to Germany, that son actually and her daughter Richenza were left in England to be raised in England rather than Germany.
Oh, that's
So yeah, it must have been really nice for her to have her mum there with her, when she was giving birth. You hear a lot of, and this is a thing that surprised me in writing about all the princesses of England. You hear a lot of, it's the meme, isn't it? My daughter said she wanted to be treated like a princess, so I married her off to the King of Poland in return for some land and never saw her again. It's very rare, actually, that they weren't seen again. Matilda spent time with her mum and dad. Joan was widowed and just happened to have recently been widowed when her brother landed in Sicily on his way to the Crusades. So she ended up joining Richard the Lionheart on Crusade and then marrying the Count of Toulouse back in France later on. And she actually spent time with her mum when her mum brought Richard's wife to Sicily to marry Richard. So, and even Eleanor in Castile, when King John wanted to make a peace arrangement with Philip II, that was, like we said, sealed with a marriage. And John didn't have, it was only 1202. John didn't have any daughters old enough to marry. Actually, he didn't have any daughters. He'd only just got married to a girl who was very young. He had illegitimate daughters, but no legitimate ones. And a king of France wasn't going to marry an illegitimate daughter of a man, even if it was a king of England. So John had to find someone who was noble, royal enough to tempt Philip II. And he sent his mum, Eleanor of Aquitaine, who was around 80 at the time, to Castile. So down through France. Well, actually, I think she was at Fontainebleau at the time. So south through France, over the Pyrenees, into Castile, to meet her daughter and decide which of her granddaughters was going to be Queen of France. And she spent a month with Eleanor in Castile. And it's like this idea that the daughters just never saw their family again. Eleanor of Aquitaine saw all three of her daughters by Henry II after they'd been married.
Wow, that's pretty cool. I never knew that. I guess I was also
Mm,
under the assumption that they get shipped off and, like Catherine of Aragon left Spain and never
yeah.
saw her mom and dad again.
Well, it's actually rare when you look through it. There are some instances where they only get to communicate by letter, but more often than not, they did get to see family members again, even if it wasn't a total reuniting with the family. There's Henry III's sister, King John's daughter Isabella, married the Holy Roman Emperor, Frederick II, and she was visited by her brother Richard when he was on the way to Crusades, and probably also by Simon de Montfort and his wife Eleanor, who was Isabella's sister, when Simon de Montfort went on crusade. So they did find ways of seeing each other and, just making sure. I mean, when with Isabella, John's daughter, when Richard arrived at the imperial court, his sister wasn't there. She may have still been recovering from childbirth. So he didn't see her straight away, but he stayed there until he'd seen his sister.
That's quite amazing. I like that
Yeah.
story. That's good to know that there was that familial connection
Mm,
between them. And I'm sure part of it was reporting back, right? Like, yep, she's
yeah.
okay. She's doing what she's supposed to be doing.
Yeah, exactly. It's just this idea that royal daughters were just surplus to requirements, had no purpose, and were just married off to get rid of them. It wasn't the case. And they did keep an eye on them and make sure that they were all right and, made sure that they were healthy and happy and visited them if they were in the area.
Yeah, I love that. Well, okay, so we've talked about Matilda. Let's journey to the next daughter. I think you said her name is Eleanor, named after her mother.
Yes, Eleanor, she's usually referred to as Leonor. I think it's actually to distinguish between her and her mum, and also because she was Queen of Castile. So in Castile, it would have been Leonor rather than Eleanor.
Okay.
So she was married about the same age as Matilda, about 10 or 11 years old. And she was married to the King of Castile, Alfonso. And yeah, they had a very good relationship, even though they had, like I said, they had some tragedies with their children, with some of the children dying early, dying young, or some miscarriages. But they seem to have been really happy together. There's so many instances of them being close and traveling together, working together, raising the children together. Um, they ended up having two sons who survived childhood and a number of daughters. They founded a monastery, Las Huelgas, in I don't know if that's how you pronounce it right, in Burgos, which is where Edward I married Eleanor of Castile a couple of generations later.
Oh, interesting. I love those little connections.
Yeah, but she's Eleanor's credited with bringing what is it? Um Poitevin culture to the court of Castile. So she was very much, very arty, like the troubadour tradition of southern France. So and she brought the arts and architecture, and she's what was it? Queen Leonor, modestly clad in a mantle of rich stuff, red with a silver border wrought with golden lions. She was
Ooh,
elegant and gracious. They actually fell in love with her, I think, in Castile. She was very popular queen.
I'm curious. You mentioned the architecture and art and stuff like that with her, bringing that with her. Where would she have learned about that kind of stuff? What was her mother interested in those things, or was it just a passion?
Yeah, well, she grew up. She did spend some of her time when Henry II's relationship with Eleanor of Aquitaine began to break down. Eleanor moved to Aquitaine for a while, to Poitou, its capital, and which is where she trained Richard to. He was originally intended to succeed her as Duke of Aquitaine, whilst his older brother Henry became King of England. And she took her children with her. She had Eleanor was with her, and Joanna at various points. Joanna was educated at Fontainebleau for a while. She and John were both sent to Fontainebleau to pursue some education, but then she would often visit her mum because they weren't, Poitou wasn't far away from Fontainebleau. So yeah, she would have grown up in the cultured court of Poitou and, surrounded by all that beauty and the romance of the troubadours and all the, romantic songs and things. She must have, that seems to have been a great influence on her, so that she took with her to Castile.
I love
Even though,
that.
like I say, she was only 10. Or, yeah, she was only about 9 or 10 when she went to Castile, but she's lived it, so,
Yeah.
and remembering a little bit of her childhood must have been lovely to be able to extend that influence into her own new world.
Yeah, I love the idea that she just kind of loved the things that she saw on her travels. It's kind of like when we
Mm,
travel today, right? We want to keep a piece of those things that have ingrained in our
mm.
memories.
Yeah, and she would have travelled even by the age of 10. She would have been a well-travelled girl. I mean, Matilda was still a baby when she first crossed the English. She was born in England, but when she first crossed the English Channel, she was still a baby. Eleanor of Aquitaine went over to Normandy to join Henry II, taking with her Henry the Young King, Richard, who was about 2 or 3, and little Matilda as well. Travelling was a part of their lives. The the Angevin Empire, the Plantagenet Empire, it stretched from the Scottish border to the border with Spain in southern France. So traveling was part of their lives.
Gosh, it makes me wonder, and I don't mean to keep bringing up the Tudors, but when we get to Henry VII and Henry VIII and the other Tudor monarchs, they didn't really leave England.
No, they didn't
I,
even leave. I mean, when you look at, what is it? Elizabeth I never travelled further north than East Anglia, I think it was. And same with Mary. They didn't even leave southern England.
yeah, I mean, at least I guess Henry VIII went to Calais, but it was an
Mm,
English territory at the time, right? So does that
yeah,
even
well,
count?
he went to war in France, didn't he?
Oh,
And
yes, that's right.
um, but yeah, I think the most well-travelled Tudor was probably Henry VII, who grew up in Brittany.
Yeah.
But everybody else, I think it might have been that fear of coming home to find somebody else had taken the throne,
Mm,
because the still that feeling that maybe we aren't the rightful kings. They can say it as much as they want, but in the back of their minds, there might be actually there are others with greater claim. So
yeah.
leaving England's shores was like, we might be in trouble here.
That's a good point. I guess I hadn't thought about that, about how they were still that in that wary state of whether or not
Mm,
they were rightful heirs to the throne after the death of Richard III. And so
mm,
having to stay near England, I guess, makes sense in that respect. But these, Eleanor and Henry II and their family, they lived in a different time. They clearly
yes.
had the right to the throne, and they were
Mm,
able to travel because I'm fascinated by this story that they were able to travel all over the place, because it seems
mm.
so foreign to somebody who studies the Tudors that they were able to do that.
Well, it was essential that they travelled all over the place as well, because in those days, the presence of the king was really important. They had to be everywhere so that there weren't rebellions, and so that people knew who their ruler was.
Yeah.
Once, and because they had such a massive empire and so many disparate peoples, you had the English in England, the Normans in Normandy. They were still very distinctive nationalities. Even, yes, Normandy's in France, so is Aquitaine, but they didn't even speak, the Normans and the Aquitanians didn't even speak the same language. In Aquitaine, in Normandy it was Norman French, in Aquitaine it was Occitan. So they didn't, there was so much, there was equal amounts of similarities as differences in the different counties and lands that the Plantagenets ruled. So they had to be everywhere to make sure everything stayed peaceful. Whereas with Henry VIII, they just ruled England and Calais, and that was it. So they didn't have the need to travel to keep hold of their lands. The earlier kings had done.
What do you think the biggest contribution daughter Eleanor made to history? Do you think it's architecture and art, or is there more?
I think it is the fact, actually, that although her daughter Berenguela or Berengaria did abdicate in favour of her son, she did actually take the crown. She acted as regent for her son after her abdication. But she was allowed, she ruled, she wasn't challenged as a ruler. And when you look at what had happened with her Leonor's grandmother, so Berenguela's great grandmother, Empress Matilda in the anarchy, that in itself is a good feat, and it's the reputation of Leonor and Alfonso that makes that happen.
I still think that Empress Matilda was the first queen regnant of England.
Totally agree with you. She was named Lady of the English, which in those days would have been a title for a regnant. A queen in the 12th century was the wife of a king, not an individual independent ruler. So the fact that she wasn't proclaimed queen doesn't mean that she wasn't ruler.
Right. There was so much more to history before the Tudors, wasn't there?
There was.
I mean, when we look back, they really paved the way. These women paved the way for Mary the First and Elizabeth the First.
What these women were capable of in a time. The thing is, we don't have a lot of records on them, unfortunately, and that's because history was written by men for men. But it doesn't mean they weren't there. It doesn't mean they didn't achieve remarkable things, and that they weren't expected to achieve remarkable things. We've got this attitude that women in those days were just decoration, only there to produce children and to continue the family line. They weren't. They were there to make a solid contribution to international relations.
Yeah, and they definitely did that, didn't they?
Yeah. And they had to, and it's funny, it's when you think about it, it was so much more than what any diplomat expected to do now, because they actually had to marry somebody and keep him on side as well, whilst keeping the peace between the country of the man they married and the country of their father and brother. And
seems like a lot of pressure.
Yeah, it's like, no pressure. If you don't keep the peace, we're going to war.
Yeah, it's your fault.
Yeah, it didn't always succeed, but more often than not, it did.
Well, I want to know now about the youngest daughter of Eleanor of Aquitaine, because I feel like there's more coming out about her recently. I know nothing about her, but I would love to learn about her. So you said her name was Joanna or Joan, right?
Yeah, Joanna. I always think of her as Joanna, and so does her biographer. There's a new biography out called Lioness Heart by Catherine Hanley, Catherine's a wonderful writer and so easy to read.
I'm looking for it. That book is in my to be read pile right now, so I'm really looking forward to it.
Same here. And I do a podcast, A Slice of Medieval, and we've got Catherine coming on in a few weeks to talk. And it's like, yes,
Oh,
I cannot wait.
exciting. Yes.
Because I'm like thinking, oh, poor Derek, my co-host, is just going to be sat there listening because me and Catherine are going to talk about Joanna.
I can't wait. Why don't you start off by telling me what you know about her?
Oh, she is one of my personal favorites. She's one of the reasons I wrote Heroines of the Medieval World in the first place, because this woman had a life at a time where, yes, even women who led an exciting life would marry and travel a little bit. But Joanna, at 10 years old, was sent to marry the King of Sicily. When he dies, she gets imprisoned by the illegitimate son of his brother, Tancred, so that he wants to claim Sicily and keep hold of Joanna's dowry. So he claims Sicily and imprisons Joanna so that he can keep her dowry. The only problem for him is that Richard the Lionheart has decided to go on crusade and decides to stop off at Sicily and see if he can get some extra funds from his brother-in-law. Finds out his brother-in-law's dead and his sister's been imprisoned. Tancred not providing the king with a nice warm welcome. So Richard literally takes the city and forces Tancred to agree to release Joanna and release Joanna's dowry and pay some extra funds to Richard for the crusade. Joanna's never actually gets her dowry because Richard just appropriates it for his crusading funds. But at least Joanna's released. And then Eleanor of Aquitaine brings Richard's bride, Berengaria of Navarre, down to Sicily. So Joanna gets to say hello to her mum for a couple of days before Eleanor turns around and goes back to England, because she's helping to take care of England while Richard's absent on crusade. So she can't stick around too long in Italy. So Joanna's got basically gets a new friend in Berengaria of Navarre. The two lodged together there, and Joanna looks after Berengaria until Richard marries her. But then after Sicily, they head for the Holy Land. The ships get separated in a massive storm on the Mediterranean, and Berengaria and Joanna end up anchoring near Cyprus. And they were hoping to land on Cyprus and wait for Richard to find them. But the King of Cyprus, the Emperor of Cyprus, decides actually imprisons any of the crusaders who make it to shore. Basically loot the ships that have been damaged in the storm, kill some of the sailors and soldiers as well. So Berengaria and Joanna anchor offshore and just sit there and wait for Richard to come and find them. Richard does find them, proceeds to conquer Cyprus, as you do.
Right.
Then marries Berengaria on Cyprus before they all decide to continue their journey to the Holy Land. And so Joanna is part of Richard's crusading army. She and Berengaria tag along behind the army. Away from the battles, they're given quarters at various places in Palestine while Richard's off fighting his battles and things. But she's a constant companion of Berengaria, and they do become good friends. And then when Richard decides to leave Palestine, Berengaria and Joanna go in one ship, Richard in another. Richard, unfortunately, decides to ends up landing in the wrong place and getting captured by the Germans. So Joanna and Berengaria are in Rome waiting for Richard to meet them there, and he never turns up. And once they hear that he's captured, they make their way then to France and to Aquitaine, and they're escorted through the various lands by the Count of Toulouse and the Count's son Raymond. So this is the first time she meets her future husband, But she doesn't know he's her future husband. No one knows he's her future husband at that point, but at least she's met him. And then they sit in France waiting for Richard to get released and to come home. Unfortunately, the marriage of Richard and Berengaria is not, it's one of those quite unsuccessful ones on a personal level. On a diplomatic level, her brother Sancho and Richard were good friends. And keeping the relationship with Navarre was good for Richard because, it's on this, Navarre's one of those kingdoms that's in a very strange position. It's on the Spanish-French border. It sort of crosses both lands. So sometimes you see it referred to as a Spanish kingdom, and sometimes you see it referred to as a French kingdom. And of course, the French king of Navarre, Henry II, I think it was, became Henry IV of France. So the relationship for Navarre is it's in this crucial position between Spain and France. So it's a very useful ally. But Richard and Berengaria, I think they say Richard spent 6 months in England. I think that's longer than he spent with Berengaria, to be honest. They don't appear to have been compatible as a couple. So they never had children, and they appear to have spent very little time together. But Berengaria and Joanna had a great friendship and seem to have enjoyed spending time in each other's company.
Maybe that was the problem. It was the sister poisoning the ear of her sister-in-law. You don't want to like my brother. He's terrible. I'm just kidding. That didn't happen.
He did rescue you in Sicily. Yes, he did rescue me in Sicily, but then he stole my money.
Yeah, right.
Oh, yeah.
Don't forget, keep your money close to you, sister.
Yeah. So then once Richard's released, Joanna's next marriage is arranged, which happens to be to Raymond, the Count of Toulouse, who succeeded his father by this point. So when she's told that this is who she's marrying, it's like, well, I've met him, so I know him. And he must have been quite a good-looking chap and quite debonair, because apparently he married everybody. The problem when he married Joanna was he was already married to possibly 2 women. Oh. He agreed to divorce one woman in order to marry Joanna, and nobody seems certain as to whether or not he was also married to another woman at the same time. So it wasn't the greatest marriage in the world for poor Joanna. It had a good start, but then Raymond's people rebelled against him, and Joanna was caught up in a siege and was wounded. She actually went to war to get this town back for Raymond, and her camp was attacked at night, and she was wounded. But instead of going back to her husband, she made her way north. She intended to go to meet with Richard the Lionheart, who was also in France at the time, to go and meet him and ask for his help. Problem was, by the time she set off, Richard had died. It was 1199. She'd heard Richard had died of his wounds at the siege of Chalus. I think it was Chalus. So she diverted to Fontainebleau, and then made her way to Rouen after Richard's death, and asked her brother John for help, and he gave her some money, and also gave her enough money so that for her will, so that she could give out donations from her will to various religious foundations. She was pregnant at the time, and she was wanted to become a nun at Fontainebleau, which was very unusual in those days. The idea of a pregnant woman being veiled as a nun was Well, for starters, she must have been married. Then she's pregnant and she's hardly a virgin. So it wasn't the done thing, but her mum persuaded the abbess at Fontainebleau that this is what Joanna wanted and that she deserved it. So she was allowed to enter the order of the nuns at Fontainebleau. She wasn't at Fontainebleau at the time. She was in Rouen with her mum, and she gave birth. And either before, and she died either before giving birth, and it was a cesarean to try and save the baby, or shortly after the baby was born. There's a bit of ambiguity in the sources. So she was buried at Fontainebleau though with her baby son in together. But yeah, she died just a few months after her brother Richard the Lionheart. But she was with her mum. You know, this is the thing that you see time and again, that I always think with Joanna, at least she was with her mum.
Yeah, what a tragic story.
Yeah, it was full of adventure. But I'm not sure whether or not she wanted all that adventure. A little bit of a quieter life might have been something she craved, considering everything she experienced in such a short life.
Well, you always want what you can't have, right?
Yeah, exactly. But I like to think that when she was married to William of Sicily, that she had a few nice years then. And that it was nice that she at least saw her mum again a few times, and that she had this friendship with Berengaria. I think she was probably the most, out of her sisters, she was the most like Richard the Lionheart in herself anyway. So I think Catherine Hanley chose the brilliant title for the book, Lioness Heart. I think it's just perfect for her.
It's so exciting. This has been such an enlightening episode for me personally, because like I said at the beginning, we always hear about the sons. We so seldom hear about the daughters. And now I feel like I have a better glimpse at the family as a whole to see what the daughters did and what they were involved in. I think it's fascinating. You know, when it comes to Eleanor and Henry II and their family, I guess I don't know how I want to ask you this, but what is your favorite part of their family story?
Oh, I don't know. There's so many. You know, I think the thing is, there is just that whole family. Because see, it's like, you know, you've got mum and dad arguing with each other. You've got the sons rebelling against the dad. You've got the daughters. I think it's more, my part is that each of the daughters got to have a relationship with their mum when they were adults.
I love that answer. That is a great answer, Sharon. Now, if people are listening today and they want to learn more about these women, what direction do you want to point them in?
Well, they are all in Heroines of the Medieval World, which was my first ever book. They're also mentioned in Ladies of Magna Carta, and they will be, there's an entire chapter dedicated to them in my next book, which will be out this time next year, which is called The Medieval Princess from the Norman Conquest to the Wars of the Roses.
Oh, I love this. I love learning about women in history, and I love going back in time before the Tudors to learn about these women who influenced later queens in history.
Yeah. They were a truly remarkable bunch, not just the three daughters of Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine, but all of them, from Adela of Normandy, who was the mother of King Stephen, who was a really well-educated, intelligent woman who ruled as regent for her oldest son and corresponded with the Archbishop of Canterbury and with the Pope. And, you know, they were all so influential and have been overlooked for way too long. So it's about time we looked into what these women did and how successful they were in their own rights in the jobs they were given as princesses.
Yeah. Sharon, thank you so much for your research into these women in history and shining a light on them. It's so important. And if anybody wants to purchase one of your books, where can they find them?
They're on Amazon. They're on in every good bookshop. Or I actually have, if you go to my website, historytheinterestingbits.com, there's a link to my online sales page where you can buy a signed copy from me.
Wonderful. Sharon Bennett Connolly, thank you so much for coming on the show again today. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you, Rebecca. It's absolutely always love talking to you. I never tire of it. It's like just chatting with a friend that, we've known each other for so long, but we don't get to talk very often.
No, I love this too. I enjoy talking with you immensely. Like you said, we go way back. So it is like hanging out or catching up with an old friend where you can just talk about history, isn't it?
It is. I've been looking forward to it all day.
Oh, thank you, Sharon. We'll have you on again soon.
Thank you very much.
And that concludes another episode of the Tudors Dynasty podcast. Thank you so much for listening. If you love the show and would like to show your support, consider becoming a patron over on Patreon. That's patreon.com/Tudors Dynasty. Over there, you'll get commercial-free episodes, early access, and some patron-exclusive content as well. If you would prefer to show your support in another way, head on over to my website, tudorsdynasty.com, and click on the shop to see some of the new merchandise that I have available. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.